The clock on the wall of the bridal suite ticks with the force of a hammer. Each strike vibrates through the vanity, through the floor, and into the soles of her feet. Amara sits on the edge of the velvet, her fingers tracing the patterns of the fabric she is meant to wear down the aisle. She does not recognize the hands moving across the material. They belong to someone else, someone who is supposed to be happy, someone who is supposed to be ready. She stares at the floor, watching the way the light shifts across the wood, counting the seconds until she has to stand. The room is too quiet. It is a vacuum, pulling the air from her lungs. She presses her palms against the vanity, feeling the cool, hard surface, trying to anchor herself to the present moment. But the present is a cage. She stands, walks to the window, and presses her forehead against the glass. The city below is moving, indifferent to the fact that her life is about to fracture. She grips the frame, her knuckles turning white, waiting for the knock at the door that will signal the end of her autonomy. The ticking continues, relentless, marking the final moments of a life she never truly chose. Beyond the glass, the Seoul skyline ignites in a haze of twilight. Neon veins pulse through the city, casting long, flickering shadows across the suite. Amara watches the traffic crawl like ants through the steel canyons, a world away from the suffocating stillness of this room. She knows the man waiting for her downstairs. He is kind. He is stable. He offers a life of predictable comfort, a fortress of safety built on solid ground. But as she turns back to the center of the room, the silence feels heavier than before. Her heart is a locked room, and the key is not here. It is miles away, held by a ghost of a memory she has tried to bury for years. She walks to the vanity, her movements slow and deliberate, and stares at the empty space where her reflection should feel real. It does not. The promise of security feels like a slow suffocation. She realizes that she is not preparing for a beginning, but for a long, quiet surrender. The city lights blur into streaks of amber and violet, indifferent to the choice she is about to make. She is standing at the edge of a precipice. The memory of the office cuts through the silence of the suite. She remembers the late nights, the hum of the ventilation. If you're just joining us, kindly subscribe to this channel for more, and the way the world narrowed down to the space between their desks. Min-jae moved with a surgical precision that left no room for error. He navigated boardrooms like a man reading a map no one else could see. She remembers the sound of his fountain pen scratching against paper, a rhythmic, sharp noise that marked the end of every hour. He never spoke of his exhaustion. He simply worked. But there were moments, fractions of a second, when the efficiency faltered. He would pause at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, his gaze lingering on her. It was a look that bypassed the professional distance, a weight that pressed against her chest. He would look away, his jaw tightening, and the silence would return, thicker than before. Those seconds were the only times the air in the office felt real. She remembered the way he would stand by the window, his back to her, watching the city, as if he were waiting for a signal to leave. The memory is not a ghost, it is a physical ache. She reaches into the folds of her robe and pulls out the phone. It feels unnervingly heavy, a cold, hard slab of glass and circuitry that holds the power to burn her world to the ground. The screen glows, casting a sharp, sterile light across her hands. She unlocks it. Her movements are mechanical, practiced, yet her fingers tremble as she scrolls through the list of names. There he is, Kang Min-jae. The name sits on the screen like a live wire. She stares at the contact entry, the letters blurring into a single, jagged line. If she touches this, there is no going back. She could lock the phone, slide it under the vanity, and walk out to the ballroom to finish what she started. She could choose the path of least resistance, the one that leads to a life of quiet, predictable safety. Her thumb hovers centimeters above the glass. The silence in the room is absolute, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of her own breathing. She feels the weight of the choice pressing down on her. She opens her eyes, her thumb still suspended, caught in the agonizing space. She stops thinking. She stops weighing the cost. Her thumb moves, tapping out the words with a frantic, rhythmic precision. If you still want me, come get me. The text sits in the input field, a small digital confession that carries the weight of a lifetime. She stares at the send icon. Her heart hammers against her ribs, a frantic, uneven beat that echoes in the quiet suite. She presses down. The screen flickers. A soft chime signals the message has left her device, launching into the void. She drops the phone onto the vanity, her hands shaking, and pulls back as if the device were burning. She braces herself for the silence. She expects the long, hollow wait that has defined their distance for years. She closes her eyes, counting the seconds, waiting for the inevitable void to swallow her plea. Then, the phone vibrates, a sharp, insistent buzz against the wood. It is not a delayed response, it is immediate. She reaches out, her breath hitching in her throat, and taps the screen. A single notification pops up, glowing in the dim light. I am coming. Across the city, the boardroom is a vacuum of sound and light. Sunlight glares off the floor-to-ceiling glass, turning the space into a fishbowl of high-stakes commerce. Min-jae stands at the head of the mahogany table, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the documents spread before him. Investors from London and Tokyo lean in, their voices a low, rhythmic drone as they discuss the terms of the legacy-securing deal. He is the anchor of the room, the man who dictates the pace and the outcome. He reaches for his fountain pen, the nib hovering over the signature line. The air in the room is thick with the scent of expensive paper and stale coffee. Then, his phone, resting near his right hand, lets out a sharp, electronic pulse. It vibrates against the polished wood, a sound like a warning. He glances down. The screen lights up, displaying the message. He stops. The pen remains suspended in the air. The investors continue to speak, but their words lose all meaning, fading into a distant, muffled hum. He stares at the screen, his pulse visible in the steady, controlled rhythm of his breathing. The room is filled with people waiting for his next move. He does not move. He is locked in a sudden, absolute stillness, the weight of the message pressing against his chest. The memory hits him with the force of a physical blow. 6 months ago, in this same room, the board had sat in a semicircle of judgment. They had laid out the terms with clinical precision. If he pursued a relationship with his assistant, the board would trigger a liquidation clause. They would strip the firm of its assets, dismantle the legacy his family had built over decades, and leave his employees with nothing. He had sat in that chair, listening to the cold math of his own destruction. They had made it clear, he could have the company, or he could have her. He chose the company. He chose the safety of the firm over the person who made the long nights in the office feel like something other than a prison sentence. He had buried his intentions under a mountain of spreadsheets and late-night meetings. He had watched her from across the desk, his jaw locked tight, forcing himself to look away. He had built a wall of professional distance, brick by brick, believing that his sacrifice was a form of protection. He thought he was saving her from the fallout of his world. He was wrong. He had only succeeded in creating a silence that nearly destroyed them both. The threat that once held him captive now feels like a hollow, distant echo. The screen glows with a soft, persistent light, casting a pale reflection against the polished mahogany. He stares at the words. They are simple, direct, and entirely devoid of the professional caution that has governed their interactions for years. The room around him remains trapped in a state of suspended animation. Investors lean forward, their faces expectant, waiting for the signature. He does not see them. He sees only the cursor blinking at the end of her sentence. The air in the room feels suddenly thin. He feels the familiar, rigid structure of his self-control beginning to fray. It is not a sudden collapse, but a slow, tectonic shift. The logic that has guided his every move for 3 years, the need to protect, to distance, is rendered obsolete by a single line of text. His hand, resting on the table, twitches. The muscles in his neck, usually held in a state of permanent tension, finally slacken. He is no longer the CEO managing a global firm. He is a man confronted with the only thing he has ever truly wanted. The fountain pen feels heavy, like a lead weight in his grip. He looks at the document, then at the faces of the men across the table. They are waiting for a signature, for a commitment to a future that no longer holds any meaning for him. He does not speak. If you're just joining us, kindly subscribe to this channel for more. He does not offer an explanation or an apology. He simply lets go. The pen hits the mahogany table with a sharp, hollow clatter that cuts through the sterile atmosphere of the room. The sound echoes against the glass walls, startling the investors into silence. He pushes his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. He stands, his movements fluid and final. The lead investor starts to speak, a question forming on his lips, but Min-jae is already moving. He ignores the rising chorus of confused shouts and the frantic rustle of papers. He does not look back at the contract, the legacy, or the men who have held him hostage to their demands for years. He turns his back on the table, his stride purposeful and unyielding. The room erupts into a cacophony of protest, but the noise is distant, irrelevant. He has made his choice. He hits the corridor, his pace accelerating into a run. The floor beneath his feet feels slick, the polished marble reflecting the harsh overhead lights. An assistant steps into his path, tablet raised, mouth open to deliver a report, but he sidesteps without breaking stride. The assistant stumbles, forced to press against the wall to avoid a collision. He does not acknowledge the confusion behind him. His focus is locked on the elevators. He slams his palm against the call button, the metal cool and unyielding under his skin. When the doors slide open, he steps inside and hits the lobby level. The descent feels agonizingly slow. As the doors part again, the lobby greets him with the low hum of afternoon activity. He pushes out into the open space, his stride long and relentless. Voices call out his name from the reception desk, sharp and questioning, but he keeps his eyes fixed on the revolving glass doors ahead. He ignores the security guards who start to move toward him, their hands raised in a gesture of confusion. He reaches the exit, pushes his weight against the heavy glass, and forces the doors to spin. The cool air of the city hits his face, sharp and biting. The sedan sits idling at the curb, its engine a low, vibrating hum. He pulls the door shut and locks it, the sound echoing in the confined space. His hands grip the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he shifts into gear and peels away from the sidewalk. The traffic is a wall of steel, a gridlock of brake lights stretching into the distance. He does not wait for a gap. He swerves into the oncoming lane, the tires screeching against the asphalt as he forces his way through the intersection. A delivery truck blares its horn, the sound deafening, and he jerks the wheel hard to the left, missing the bumper by inches. He does not slow down. He pushes the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring in protest as the needle climbs. The neon lights of the city blur into long, jagged streaks of color against the glass. He weaves between lanes, his movements sharp and precise. Every red light is a barrier he ignores, every turn a calculated risk. He is a blur of motion, a streak of black steel cutting through the heart of the evening. The roar of the engine fades into a dull, rhythmic thrum against the glass. He keeps his foot steady on the accelerator, but his grip on the wheel loosens, then tightens again. The silence inside the cabin is heavier than the noise of the city outside. He remembers the boardroom, the smell of mahogany and stale coffee, and the cold, measured voices of the directors. They had promised to dismantle everything he built if he ever stepped out of line. For years, he treated that threat as a cage, a set of invisible walls he had to navigate with surgical precision. Now, the walls are gone. The realization hits him with the force of a physical blow. He is not just driving toward a hotel. He is driving away from a life that was never his own. Every mile he covers is a bridge burned, a contract voided, a piece of his own autonomy recovered from the machinery of the firm. He glances at the passenger seat, empty and cold, and feels the crushing weight of the secret he has carried for 3 years. It is a burden that has defined his every move, but as he rounds the final corner toward the hotel, the weight begins to shift. He is no longer an agent of the company. He is a man acting on his own terms, and for the first time, the path ahead feels entirely his to define. The first notes of the string quartet drift up through the ventilation ducts, thin and sharp. They are meant to be celebratory, but in the sterile quiet of the suite, they sound like a countdown. Amara stands by the window, watching the city lights flicker, but the music pulls her attention back to the center of the room. She moves to the vanity, her palms pressing hard against the cool marble surface to steady the tremor in her hands. Each chord vibrates through the floorboards, a rhythmic pulse that matches the hammering of her own heart. She walks to the door and presses her ear against the wood, listening to the muffled murmur of guests gathering in the ballroom below. The music swells, a crescendo that fills the hallway, and she pulls back as if the sound itself has physical weight. She paces the length of the room, her footsteps silent on the carpet, trying to find a corner where the melody cannot reach her. There is no escape. The air in the suite feels thin, the space closing in, and every tick of the wall clock is now drowned out by the encroaching sound of a life she is not ready to begin. The music reached a final, sustained chord that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the suite. Then, silence. It was a sudden, hollow vacuum that felt more dangerous than the noise. Amara remained frozen in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. A sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the stillness. 3 deliberate knocks. Each one struck the wood with a dull thud that echoed in her chest. She did not move. Her lungs felt constricted, the oxygen in the room suddenly scarce. The handle turned slightly, a metallic click that signaled the barrier was no longer absolute. From the other side, a voice drifted in, low and calm. It was her fiancé, his tone carrying a gentle, expectant warmth that made her stomach churn. He asked if she was ready to descend. The question hung in the air, a simple inquiry that demanded a life-altering answer. She stared at the door, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force. The knock faded, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Amara looked at the door, but she no longer saw a barrier. She saw the threshold of a life she had never truly chosen. Safety, she realized, was merely a gilded cage. It was a promise of comfort that demanded the slow erosion of her own spirit. She thought of the years spent building this path, the careful steps, the expected smiles, and the hollow weight of it all. It was a structure built on silence and compromise. The risk of losing this stability suddenly seemed trivial compared to the cost of remaining within it. She felt the floor beneath her feet, solid and unyielding, and for the first time, the terror of the unknown transformed into a sharp, cold clarity. She did not want to be safe. She wanted to be real. She walked to the center of the room, her movements deliberate and stripped of hesitation. The hammering in her chest slowed, replaced by a steady, rhythmic focus. She was no longer waiting for the next knock. She was waiting for the moment she would finally break the lock. The truth was a jagged edge. A soft, electronic chime echoed through the quiet corridor of the hotel floor. The elevator doors slid open with a smooth, mechanical hiss. Min-jae stepped out into the hallway, his movements sharp and uncoordinated. He did not pause to orient himself. His tie hung loose against his chest, the knot undone, and his hair was windswept and uneven. He moved with a frantic, singular purpose that ignored the luxury of the surroundings. His stride was long, his weight shifting heavily with every step. He ignored the distant sound of music rising from the ballroom, his focus locked entirely on the room numbers ahead. He reached the hallway intersection and pivoted, his shoulder brushing the wall as he turned. He was breathing hard, a shallow, rapid rhythm. Every muscle in his frame was taut, coiled for the confrontation. He did not look for staff or guests. He looked only for the door. He covered the distance with a desperate, lunging pace, the silence broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud of his footsteps. The music from the ballroom below surged, a rhythmic, driving beat that seemed to mock the urgency of his mission. Min-jae did not slow. He pushed off the wall, his feet finding purchase on the thick carpet as he accelerated. The hallway stretched out, a long, narrow tunnel of dim light and shadows. Each stride was a calculated effort to bridge the gap. Before the ceremony reached its final, irreversible moment, he could hear the muffled laughter of guests through the closed doors. He passed, a stark contrast to the silence he carried in his own lungs. His breath came in sharp, jagged bursts, burning in his chest. He ignored the sting of exertion, his eyes fixed on the final door at the end of the hall. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him as he rounded the final corner, his momentum carrying him forward with reckless speed. The sound of his own footsteps grew louder, a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat. He was a man running against time itself, his muscles coiled and ready to shatter the stillness of the room ahead. He stopped. The sudden absence of movement made the air in the hallway feel heavy and still. Min-jae stood directly before the door, his chest rising and falling in deep, ragged cycles. He pressed his palms against the wood, the surface cool and unyielding under his skin. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to the brass knob beneath his right hand. He did not turn it immediately. He stood there, eyes closed, listening to the muffled, rhythmic thrum of the wedding march vibrating through the structure. He could feel the cold metal of the handle biting into his palm, a sharp, grounding sensation that cut through the haze. He took one final, steadying breath, his fingers tightening around the cold brass. With a sudden, sharp twist, the latch clicked. He did not hesitate again. He threw his weight forward, the door swinging inward on silent hinges, revealing the space beyond. The door swung wide, letting a slice of hallway light cut across the dim interior of the suite. Amara was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to the entrance, staring out at the hazy twilight of the city. She did not move at first, assuming the knock was the hotel staff or the man waiting for her in the ballroom below. She began to turn, her movements slow and deliberate, the fabric of her gown shifting with a soft, rhythmic rustle against the floor. As she pivoted, the light from the doorway caught her profile, illuminating the sharp tension in her posture. She expected to see a face she knew, a routine check-in before the ceremony. Instead, her eyes widened as they landed on the figure standing in the threshold. She froze mid-turn, her breath catching in her throat. The air in the room seemed to thin, the ambient noise of the city outside fading into a distant, muted hum. She simply stood there, her body angled toward him, her gaze fixed on his face, caught in the sudden, jarring collision of her past and her present. The room held its breath. Min-jae remained anchored in the doorway, his chest heaving with the remnants of his frantic arrival. Across the distance, Amara stood motionless, the space between them charged with the electricity of years of unspoken words. Neither moved, neither looked away. The silence was not empty. It was a physical weight, thick and suffocating, pressing against their skin. Every second that ticked by felt like an hour of suppressed history rising to the surface. Amara watched his eyes, searching for the man she had known in the sterile quiet of his office, finding instead a raw intensity that stripped away all pretense. Min-jae returned the gaze, his own focus unwavering, his pupils dilating as he drank in the sight of her. The city noise outside, the distant sirens, the hum of traffic vanished completely. There was only the sound of their synchronized, shallow breathing. In this singular, unfiltered moment, the wedding, the ballroom, and the life she was meant to live dissolved into nothingness. The stillness broke with the sound of his boots shifting against the hardwood. Min-jae took one step into the room, then another, his movements deliberate yet strained. He stopped just inches from her, the space between them vibrating with the force of his proximity. He raised his right hand, his fingers splayed, reaching toward the line of her cheek. His hand trembled, a subtle, rhythmic twitch that betrayed the composure he was fighting to maintain. He stopped his movement mid-air. His fingertips hovered, barely a breath away from her skin, feeling the heat radiating from her. The air between them seemed to warp, charged with the sudden, violent desire to bridge the gap and the crushing weight of the consequences. Then, with a sharp, jagged intake of breath, he curled his fingers into a fist and pulled his hand back. He stood there, chest rising and falling, his hand clenched tightly at his side, the physical act of retreat leaving a hollow, echoing silence. Min-jae swallowed hard, his throat working against the dryness that had settled there. He did not look away. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his posture rigid as he prepared to speak. When the sound finally came, it was not the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms. It was low, steady, and stripped of all artifice. "I have nothing left to offer you but the truth," he said. The words hung in the air, simple and heavy. He did not move his hands. He did not pace. He simply stood, his chest rising and falling with each measured breath. He spoke again, his tone dropping even lower, vibrating with a sincerity that seemed to drain the remaining tension from his shoulders. Every word was a deliberate act of shedding the armor he had worn for years. He was no longer the man who navigated corporate hierarchies. He was offering the only thing he had left, laying his reality bare in the quiet of the suite. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "The company, the legacy, it is all gone," he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He described the finality of it. the documents he shredded, the digital records he wiped clean, and the bridge he burned with every investor who had once relied on his name. He spoke of the boardroom, the mahogany table, and the moment he walked out, leaving his signature unsigned and his future unwritten. There was no hesitation in his tone as he recounted the dismantling of his own life. He had systematically erased the identity that had defined him for a decade. Every action he took that morning was a deliberate strike against the expectations that had kept them apart. He stood before her now, hands open, palms facing upward, a gesture of total surrender. He had arrived with empty hands, stripped of the influence and power that had once been his only currency. The weight of the world he had walked away from seemed to leave his shoulders with every sentence he spoke. He was no longer a man of cold efficiency. He was a man who had traded his entire history for this single, uncertain moment. He waited, his breathing slow and rhythmic, fully present in the silence that followed his admission, his entire existence now anchored only to the space between them. Amara watched him, her focus narrowing until the rest of the room blurred into insignificance. She saw the tremor in his fingers, a detail he would have hidden behind a desk only days ago. The man standing before her was not the cold, efficient machine she had served for years. He was a person drowning in the same suffocating expectations. She traced the lines around his eyes, noting the exhaustion that had replaced his usual, impenetrable mask. For 3 years, she had watched him navigate boardrooms like a surgeon, always precise, always distant. Now, the precision was gone. She felt the heavy silence of the suite pressing in, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a threshold. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had not just walked away from a company. He had walked away from a life. She did not need to speak. She took a single step forward, the floorboards creaking, and reached out to bridge the final gap. The silence in the suite was suddenly pierced by a low, resonant hum rising from the ballroom floors below. It was the organ, its deep notes vibrating through the soles of her feet, signaling the start of the ceremony. Every chord felt like a hammer strike against the stillness. Amara looked toward the heavy oak door, the music growing in intensity, filling the gaps in the air with a relentless, rhythmic demand. It was a countdown. Downstairs, guests were shifting in their seats, the collective rustle of movement drifting up through the vents like a rising tide. She could almost hear the officiant clearing his throat, the anticipation of the crowd acting as a physical weight pulling her toward the aisle. Each note of the wedding march was a reminder that her window of opportunity was closing. The music swelled, a grand, sweeping melody. The air in the suite grew thin, charged with the pressure of the hundreds of people waiting for her arrival. The music reached a sharp, piercing crescendo. She had seconds before the silence of the suite was shattered by the arrival of those sent to find her. The final chord of the organ music hung in the air for a heartbeat before vanishing, leaving a vacuum of silence that was immediately filled by a new sound. From the hallway, a rhythmic, heavy thudding began. Footsteps. They were fast, purposeful, and getting louder with every stride. Amara turned her head toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was not the slow, measured pace of a guest. It was the sharp, urgent gait of someone sent to retrieve her. Beside her, the man she had chosen stiffened, his posture shifting from stillness to readiness. The footsteps echoed against the marble floors, a metallic, ringing cadence that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the door itself. Each step was a countdown, shortening the distance between their sanctuary and the inevitable confrontation. They were trapped between the window and the door. The thudding grew louder, rhythmic and relentless, until it reached the threshold. Then, as if the person outside had suddenly realized their target was behind the wood, the movement stopped. The hallway fell into a dead, heavy quiet. The air in the suite turned frigid, the silence now so thick it felt like a physical barrier. The silence in the hallway was not an end, but a preparation. It held for 5 seconds, then 10, each passing moment stretching the tension until the air in the suite felt brittle. Then, the brass handle began to move. It did not jerk or slam. It turned with a slow, agonizing precision. The internal spring of the lock groaned. If you're just joining us, kindly subscribe to this channel for more a metallic protest that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. Amara watched the metal rotate, her focus narrowing to the single point where the latch met the frame. The click of the mechanism disengaging was sharp and final. There was no going back. The wood of the door shuddered as the pressure shifted, the frame groaning under the weight of the person on the other side. The handle completed its arc, pointing downward, held there for a heartbeat of absolute stillness. Then, the door began to swing inward. It moved with a slow, deliberate speed, revealing a sliver of the hallway light that cut across the carpeted floor. Whatever was coming, it was here. The door drifted inward, a slow, sweeping arc that exposed the dim hallway beyond. Amara pressed her back against the vanity, her fingers digging into the velvet until her knuckles turned white. She held her breath, the sound of her own pulse drumming in her ears like a frantic warning. Every fiber of her being braced for the sight of the officiant, or perhaps the hotel security sent to drag her back to the ceremony. She watched the sliver of light from the corridor stretch across the floor, lengthening as the door continued its path. A shadow fell across the threshold, dark and elongated, blocking the light from the hallway. She did not move. She did not blink. The air in the room felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the sheer weight of the moment. Outside, the muffled sound of distant wedding music continued. The figure on the other side remained still, a silhouette against the bright corridor, neither entering nor retreating. The door stopped moving, hanging open just enough to reveal the truth. The door swung wide, hitting the wall with a sharp, resonant thud that echoed through the suite. It was not the officiant. Min-jae stepped across the threshold, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps that filled the sudden void of the room. He did not stop to close the door behind him. He moved into the center of the space, his steps heavy and uncoordinated, his presence shattering the artificial calm of the bridal suite. He stopped abruptly, his feet skidding slightly on the polished floor, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. He looked as though he had run through the entire city to reach this floor. He stood there for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, his shoulders rising and falling as he fought to regain control of his lungs. The air between them hummed with the force of his arrival. He did not speak, but the way he leaned forward, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet, signaled that he was ready to move again. He had arrived, and in that single, breathless moment, the life she had been building for months simply ceased to exist. Min-jae did not look away. He took a single, deliberate step toward her, his boots clicking against the hardwood. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the cold, measured tone she remembered from the office. It was raw, vibrating with a jagged edge. "I destroyed them," he said, the words hitting the space between them like stones. "Every contract, every legal document that bound me to that firm. I burned the bridges while the board was still screaming for my signature." He paused, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "There is nothing left to go back to. No legacy, no company, no safety net." He gestured vaguely toward the door. His hands shook, a subtle, rhythmic tremor that he made no effort to hide. "I walked away from everything I was told to be." His voice cracked, a sharp, sudden sound that punctuated the silence. He leaned in, his posture losing its rigid, corporate tension. He had traded his entire world for the possibility of a single, uncertain future, and the finality of his surrender left the air heavy. Amara stared at his outstretched hand. The room felt suddenly hollow, the luxury of the suite fading into the background as the reality of his words took hold. He had dismantled his entire existence, leaving himself with nothing but the choice he had made to find her. She did not hesitate. She moved forward, the fabric of her gown brushing against the vanity as she closed the distance between them. She reached out and grabbed his hand, her fingers wrapping around his palm with a grip that was firm, steady, and entirely decisive. Her knuckles whitened as she squeezed, anchoring him to the spot. The tremor in his hand stopped the moment their skin touched. She pulled him closer, her gaze locked onto his, communicating a silent, absolute acceptance of the ruin he had brought to her doorstep. There was no room for doubt now. The future he had offered was chaotic, stripped of status and security, but as she held his hand, she felt the pulse of a life she actually wanted to lead. She looked only at him, her grip tightening until her own pulse thrummed against his skin. They stood locked together, a single unit of defiance. Amara released his hand only to pull him toward the door. They moved as one, crossing the threshold of the suite and spilling into the carpeted hallway. The sound of their footsteps was sharp, frantic, and entirely out of place in the quiet, opulent corridor. A passing server dropped a tray of champagne flutes. The glass shattered against the floor, but neither of them slowed down. They rounded the corner, their momentum carrying them toward the service elevator. Hotel staff turned, faces frozen in confusion. Amara reached the service door and shoved it open, the metal frame groaning under the force. They plunged into the narrow, dimly lit stairwell, their breathing ragged and loud in the confined space. They hit the button for the service elevator, the light blinking in a rhythmic, impatient pulse. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Voices echoed from the hallway behind them, growing louder, demanding answers they had no intention of giving. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open with a slow, mechanical grind. They scrambled inside. The doors clicked shut, sealing them in silence. The elevator dropped, the cable humming a low, vibrating note that traveled through the floor and into their feet. Amara pressed her palms against the cold steel wall, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Min-jae stood inches away, his eyes fixed on the floor numbers as they flickered downward. Suddenly, the lift shuddered. A violent metallic screech echoed through the shaft, and the car lurched to a dead stop. They swayed, catching their balance against each other. Silence returned, heavier than before, filled only by the distant, muffled sound of the city. He looked at her, his jaw set, and reached out to press the emergency button. The machinery groaned in response, the gears grinding as the lift groaned back to life, descending the final few meters. It hit the ground floor with a heavy thud. The doors parted to reveal the loading dock, a cavernous space of concrete and shadows. They did not hesitate. They stepped out into the cool, damp air of the alleyway. Rain misted the pavement, turning the neon lights of Seoul into blurred streaks of color. They found shelter in a narrow alleyway cafe, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and damp pavement. The space was small, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long, steady shadows against the brick. Min-jae pulled a stack of papers from his pocket and dropped them onto the scarred wooden table. He did not speak at first, but the sound of the pages hitting the surface was final. He explained the bridges he had burned. Amara listened, watching the way his hands finally stopped shaking. The cold, distant man she had known was gone. Outside, the sky began to bleed from charcoal to a pale, bruised violet. They walked to the edge of the Han River. The city began to stir, the distant hum of traffic rising. They stood in the stillness, the water reflecting the shifting colors. They turned away from the river, walking into the waking city, moving toward a path they had finally claimed. The morning air turned crisp as the first commuters began to fill the sidewalks. Amara watched the flow of people, their footsteps rhythmic against the concrete. Beside her, the silence was no longer a barrier, but a bridge. They had spent years navigating the rigid structures of a corporate world, but here, amidst the rush of the waking city, those structures held no power. She took a breath, the scent of the city coffee, exhaust, and damp earth filling her lungs. Min-jae looked toward the horizon, where the light caught the glass of the skyscrapers, turning them into pillars of gold. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a brief, grounding contact that signaled the end of their flight. They did not speak of the life they had abandoned or the challenges that waited in the coming days. There was no need. The choice had been made, and the consequences were theirs to carry. As the crowd surged around them, they stepped forward, moving in sync with the pulse of the streets. They were no longer defined by the expectations of others. They were simply two people walking into the light of a morning they had fought to earn. The city swallowed them whole, as architects of a future that was finally their own. The neon glow of the city center faded into the gray haze of the outskirts. The roar of traffic softened to a distant hum, then vanished entirely as they crossed the bridge leading away from the urban sprawl. Amara stopped walking, her feet aching from the long hours, and turned to look back at the skyline. It was a jagged silhouette against the brightening sky, a monument to the life she had walked away from without a single regret. Min-jae stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He did not look back. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady, anchoring her to the present moment. The path before them was unpaved, winding through the quiet fields that bordered the river. There were no maps for where they were going, and no expectations to meet. They stepped off the pavement and onto the dirt trail, their figures shrinking against the vastness of the landscape. The sun was fully up now, casting long, clear shadows that stretched toward the horizon. They walked until the city was nothing more than a memory, until the only sound was the wind through the tall grass and the rhythm of their own breathing. The struggle had been long, but the silence they found here was their own. The trail ended at a ridge that overlooked a valley untouched by the reach of the city. Below, the mist clung to the trees, slowly burning away under the rising heat of the sun. They stopped, the silence of the wilderness pressing in, absolute and profound. Amara let go of his hand, not to distance herself, but to stand independently in the space they had claimed. She looked down at her own feet, then across the expanse of the valley, realizing the weight of the past had finally dissolved. Min-jae stood near the edge, his posture relaxed, the tension that had defined his movements for years replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. He turned to her, and for the first time, there was no hidden agenda, no corporate strategy, only the reality of the present. They turned away from the ridge and began the descent, stepping into a life defined by their own choices, finally and completely free. The descent brought them to the floor of the valley, where the air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Tucked against the base of a limestone cliff stood a small, weathered cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of time. They approached it slowly, the crunch of dry leaves under their boots, the only sound in the stillness. Amara reached out, pushing the heavy wooden door. Inside, the space was empty, stripped of everything but dust and the promise of a clean slate. Min-jae moved to the center of the room, his hands brushing over the rough-hewn table, testing its stability. They spent the afternoon clearing the debris, dragging the remnants of the past out. Every piece of wood moved, every corner swept, was a deliberate act of claiming their own space. They worked in tandem, their movements synchronized. As the light began to wane, they sat on the threshold, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley floor. The horizon held no more secrets, only the quiet, steady rhythm of a future they would define together, one day at a time. Night settled over the valley, turning the sky into a deep, ink-stained expanse. Inside the cabin, the fire they had built cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, the only light in the vast darkness. Amara sat by the hearth, feeding small twigs into the flames, watching the wood catch and glow. Min-jae stood by the window, looking out toward the distant, unseen city, his hands resting on the rough sill. He turned back, the firelight catching the movement, and walked to the hearth to sit beside her. They did not speak of the bridges burned, or the titles left behind. Instead, they watched the embers pulse. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the logs, but it could not reach them. Every breath here was their own. The path behind them was closed, but the space they had carved out was theirs to keep. They were finally, irrevocably, home. Morning light bled over the ridge, turning the dew on the grass into scattered diamonds. The cabin door creaked open, and they stepped out onto the porch, the cool air sharp against their skin. Below them, the valley stretched out, untouched and expansive, a blank canvas waiting for their mark. They stood in silence, watching the mist lift from the trees, revealing the rugged terrain that would now define their days. There was no schedule to keep, no board to answer to, and no legacy to uphold but the one they were currently creating. Amara looked toward the horizon, then back at the cabin, the structure now a symbol of their autonomy. Min-jae stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the path that wound down into the woods, a route they would map together. The road ahead was unpaved and uncertain, but for the first time, the pace was entirely their own. The forest floor softened under their boots as they moved deeper into the shade of the ancient pines. Every step took them further from the world that had once demanded their silence. They reached a high point, a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the valley they had left behind. From here, the cabin was just a speck, a small anchor in a vast green sea. They stood for a long time, watching the wind ripple through the canopy, the sound like a distant ocean. There was no regret in the stillness, only the recognition of how far they had traveled. The weight of the life they had abandoned had dissolved into the mountain air. They turned away from the view, facing the dense, uncharted woods that lay ahead. The path was narrow, obscured by ferns and fallen branches, requiring them to move with care and intention. They reached out, hands brushing against the rough bark of the trees, grounding themselves in the reality of their surroundings. The silence of the wilderness was not empty, it was a promise. They walked on, side by side, their rhythms synchronized by the terrain. The future was no longer a series of expectations to be met, but a landscape to be explored. They moved forward, leaving the ghosts of their former lives to the wind, finally and completely free to write their own story. The sound of rushing water drew them toward a narrow ravine where a stream cut through the stone. They descended the bank, the ground damp and yielding under their weight. They knelt by the edge, the spray of the water cooling their skin. As they cupped their hands to drink, the water was sharp and clear, a stark contrast to the stagnant air of the life they had left behind. They sat on the mossy rocks, watching the current pull leaves and twigs downstream, carrying away the last remnants of their former burdens. There was no need for words. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space of understanding. They had traded the noise of the city for the rhythm of the earth. The fatigue of the long trek began to settle into their limbs, yet it was a heavy, satisfying exhaustion. They looked at each other, the shared history of their escape etched into the lines of their faces. They stood up, brushing the dirt from their hands, and turned toward the rising sun that filtered through the trees. The path ahead was no longer a mystery to be feared, but a reality they were prepared to build. The trees finally parted, revealing a vast meadow bathed in the golden light of the morning. They stepped out of the shadows, the tall grass brushing against their legs as they moved toward the center of the clearing. The air here was different, lighter, carrying the scent of wild clover and damp earth. They stopped, the horizon stretching out before them. There was no sound of pursuit, no echo of the life they had abandoned, only the steady hum of the world waking up around them. They stood side by side, watching the light shift across the hills, marking the passage of time in a way that felt entirely their own. They turned to one another, the weight of the past fully surrendered to the wind. They did not need to speak. They began to walk again, not toward a destination, but into the freedom of the day. Every step was a deliberate claim on their own future. The struggle had ended, leaving behind only the quiet, steady rhythm of two lives finally aligned. They moved forward, ready to build a story of their own. From the crest of the hill, the world below looked small and distant. They stopped, the wind pulling at their hair as they looked back toward the path they had carved through the wilderness. The valley was silent, the events of the past days settling into the landscape like dust. There was no regret in their gaze, only the recognition of a chapter closed. They turned away from the view, shifting their focus to the expanse of the valley ahead. The sun climbed higher, warming the ground beneath their feet. They walked down the slope, their pace measured and calm. Every movement was a testament to the life they had reclaimed. They reached the base of the hill where the terrain leveled into a wide, open plain. Here, the air was still, and the horizon promised nothing but the space to exist on their own terms. They walked side by side, their shadows stretching long and thin across the grass. The silence was no longer a weight, but a foundation. They had left behind the expectations of others, the demands of the boardrooms, and the hollow promises of their former lives. They were moving into a future defined by their own hands. With each step, the past faded into the landscape, leaving only the present, the open air, and the steady rhythm of their own hearts beating in unison. They were finally free. The plain gave way to a narrow, paved road that wound toward the distant horizon. They stopped at the edge of the transition, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. They reached into their pockets, pulling out the last physical tokens of the lives they had abandoned, and let them drop into the tall grass. There was no hesitation, no lingering glance back at the items left behind. The road stretched out, a thin ribbon of gray. They stepped onto the pavement, the change in texture underfoot signaling the start of their journey in the world of the living. The sun was now high, casting sharp shadows that moved in perfect synchronization with their stride. They walked with a steady, unhurried pace. The air was filled with the sounds of the morning. They were no longer running from anything, nor were they chasing a phantom of safety. They looked ahead, the road opening up to reveal a world that was entirely theirs to define. They were home, in the certainty of their own choices. The road finally ended at the edge of a quiet coastal town, where the land met the vast, rhythmic pulse of the ocean. They stopped, the salt spray cooling their skin as the tide pulled back from the shore. This was the boundary they had sought, a place where the noise of the city could not reach. They walked down to the water, the sand shifting and yielding beneath their weight. There were no more paths to follow, no more decisions to weigh against the expectations of others. They stood at the edge of the surf, watching the horizon where the sky bled into the deep blue of the sea. The intensity of the past months had dissolved. They sat on a weathered piece of driftwood, the wood smooth and gray. They did not speak, for the silence between them was no longer a void. They had traded a life of structure for the freedom of the unknown, and in the quiet of the morning, they found the peace they had once thought impossible. The sun rose fully, casting a golden path across the water. Their journey had reached its end, and in that stillness, they were finally home. The morning light deepened, turning the sky from pale gray to a warm, steady gold. They stood up, brushing the sand from their palms, and turned away from the shoreline. The town behind them was beginning to stir. A distant engine started. A window opened. The smell of wood smoke drifted on the breeze. They walked toward the center of the small community, their footsteps matching in cadence. There was no need for maps or plans. The uncertainty that had once felt like a threat now felt like a vast, open space. They passed a small garden where the dew still clung to the leaves, the moisture catching the early sun. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who had nothing left to hide. Every decision from this point forward would be their own, unburdened by the legacy of the past. They looked ahead, where the road continued, winding toward a future they had built. They were finally. If you're just joining us, kindly subscribe to this channel for more.